Nicolas, World Pension Council, you have a global perspective. How does the African pension fund industry fit in the global context?
Well, first, I think we have to see things in broad terms. So Africa, that's 15% of the world population. It's $2.5 trillion GDP, so that's roughly 3% of the world GDP, and I'm speaking under the authority of the World Bank. These are World Bank figures, so that's equivalent to the GDP of New York State and Texas together. And if you look at the main listed, and this is where I will come back later to what Elias said, because I agree completely and wholeheartedly with every word he said, but before switching to that, the conventional wisdom for traditional long-term asset owners, i.e. public and private pension funds, sovereign funds, is first and foremost to focus on listed assets. And if you look at the main, plain vanilla equity index, that's the MSCI World Index, right? And when you have the African continent, which represents roughly 3% of the world GDP, if you look at the components of the MSCI World Index, it's barely 0.91%, the whole of Africa. And if you look at that 1% within the world, the MSCI world, what are the components of that 1%? We'll see that Nigeria alone is a third, Egypt is like 12%, Morocco 9%, Kenya 5%. So all the rest of Africa put together, and I'm excluding South Africa, obviously. So all the rest of Africa, excluding South Africa, together is barely 25% of the rest. So it's a very minuscule blip. And if you're a pension fund manager in Toronto, Vancouver, or London, you have many procedures, many bureaucratic, or you have trustees, basically. You have trustees, risk managers, committees. Every time you make an investment, it has to go through that long process. So you're going to ask yourself a question: why am I going to spend hours going to my trustees, to my CEO, to my CIO, to invest in something which is barely 0.2% of the index? It's absolutely not interesting. Let me go and buy some shares in New York or London or Paris. Now, this is the conventional wisdom, but I really like what Elias said, and I will conclude with that I totally agree with one point he made, which is if smart money in Africa going forward in the future, especially in sub-Saharan Africa where the growth will be, I think to a large extent we'll have to focus on non-listed assets. That is private equity, venture capital, and infrastructure. And I think these will be incredibly rewarding investments. Obviously there'll be risks, and people need to do their homework, because when you're investing in a non-listed asset class, it's illiquid, so you're really stuck for, it's really for 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So you have to be careful, but I think this is where the growth will come. If you're a Northern Hemisphere pension fund or sovereign fund, I think it's very interesting and very challenging, but very interesting to go in Africa now into private equity or infrastructure.
Nicolas, thank you very much. And it can certainly endorse what the first two speakers have said. We spend a lot of time speaking to asset managers around the world and explaining how if you really want to access the opportunities in Africa, you have to go beyond the listed market. And it's not just a question of scale and liquidity. It's also a question of what sectors in the economy you're accessing by relying only on public markets. So if you want to get a broad cross-section, broad exposure to different sectors in commerce, in industry, in trade, retail, and so on, you need to go beyond the listed markets and look at private equity investing as well.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.